the final talk of the conference by the ever interesting and brilliant Miriam Schoenfield, going to talk to us about bringing permissivism debate back down to earth. Ooh, lots of permissivism this conference. Yeah. Take it away, Miriam.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, before I start, I just want to invite us all to thank Kevin and Jason and Arthur for bringing us all together for this awesome event. So thank you, everybody. And also just, I hope to join you all in Bristol sometime, but I just also want to express my enthusiasm about the fact that this project is happening and that you're bringing together all these different folks and doing all this great stuff. So just really excited about all of this. Okay, so I think it's I'm really kind of happy. I like how Ruben and I are the last two talks, because there's a kind of interesting symmetry, I think, which is that Ruben was talking about the ways in which imprecision and accuracy scores for imprecision might bear on statistics and the sciences. And I'm going to be talking about how imprecision and accuracy scores for that bear on debates in philosophy and more traditional epistemology. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about permissivism, the idea that there's more than one rational way to respond to a body of evidence, and how some of my thoughts and views about imprecision and accuracy have kind of seemed relevant to me, to these questions about permissivism. And I also just want to flag, and I'll flag this a couple points throughout the talk, is that some of the views I'm going to be kind of relying on about this are very much at odds with the views of several people in this room, like Jason, and I think Teddy and I still have some unresolved stuff about this. So, but this is about talk about permissivism. I think many rational ways to. Anyway, it's all good. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a very specific thread in the debate about permissivism. So first, just to say what permissivism is. So that's the view that there's more than one doxastic attitude that can be rationally adopted in response to a body of evidence. And the thread in the debate that I'm going to be focusing on has to do with the connection between permissivism and metaepistemology. So I'm going to call this the meta-epistemological turn. And so this is a bunch of people, myself included, who decided to present arguments about whether or not permissivism is true or false by thinking in meta-epistemological terms. And so what does that mean? That means that we're looking at the kind of practice of human beings talking about what is and isn't rational, and asking questions like, what states of mind are being expressed when we talk about rationality? What role does epistemic rationality talk play in our lives? And then trying to leverage those views in meta-epistemology to answer the question about permissivism. So I thought this was a really cool approach, which is why I participated in this project. And a lot of what I want to argue today is that it doesn't work and we should no longer do this approach. So just to say, I'm really excited. Richard's recent stuff on this is like a very different, kind of like abandoning this meta-epistemological stuff. And I'm excited about that, that way of going. Because so part of what I'm going to be suggesting is that this approach has reached a kind of impasse and is no longer fruitful. But I also hope to show how some of the moves that have been made throughout this debate might bear on some interesting things that we care about. So this may be contingent. Someone who does sociology of a rather specialized debate in a specialized subject might answer someday the question about whether or not this is contingent or not. But the philosophers who've gone this meta-epistemological route also tend to think there's a really close connection between rationality, or at least our talk and thought about rationality, and the pursuit of accuracy, either individually or collectively. So that's in the background of all of this. Okay, so I want to suggest that it's time to bring the debate back to earth. And that's because I think many of these epistemological arguments have reached a kind of impasse, and I don't think that continuing in this fashion is going to result in progress being made on the things that motivated people being interested in permissivism to begin with. Okay, so here's the plan. I want to describe a couple moves, and the moves in this debate that I'm going to describe are both there to kind of demonstrate the kind of impasse that I think we're reaching, but also highlight some sort of interesting features that I think might bear on how to proceed with the things that are interesting, even if we give up this meta-epistemological approach. Then I want to speculate on why people were interested in permissivism to begin with, and especially if you have not been like deeply immersed in this debate, I would love to hear from you. If you've ever thought this question was interesting, why did you think it was interesting? Because, yeah, anyway, this is a bit, I should just, on a personal note, say I'm having a little bit of like a philosophical crisis, just in the sense of like, I was like doing all this stuff, and now I'm like, is it interesting, and why are we doing this? And so anyway, thank you for being with me as I grapple on my way through that. But then I want to try and show how we might be able to engage with at least the reasons that I initially was interested in. I think some people were initially interested in it without maybe working out whether permissivism is true. So we might be able to sidestep the whole question, but definitely without working up the correct meta-epistemology. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is state what my next move in the meta-epistemological debate is, / was going to be. And the reason for this / is that, like, first I was like thinking I was going to make this move, and then I started thinking, is this whole approach even making any sense? Like, is this a good way to do things? So I'm making this move in a somewhat lighthearted way, but also just in terms of, as I'm divulging my own personal philosophical journey, I also am worried that there's a little bit of a like, you know, like when you're arguing with someone and you're like, okay, let's stop arguing about this, but I just have one more thing to say. It might also be a little bit of that going on. Okay, so what I am gonna argue, the argument I'm going to present now is an argument for the claim that my opponents, so these are people who are impermissivists. So I've defended permissivism. These are people who are impermissivists. So they think there's only one uniquely rational way to respond to a body of evidence. So I'm going to argue that although they say that they're impermissivists, they're not impermissivists. So they don't actually believe the view that they're articulating. And this is partially also when I started suspected that things were going haywire in this debate. I was like, what on earth are we doing here? Okay, so here are two of my opponents. There are others, but I think they're a good example. So this is Sinan Darmaja and Sophie Horowitz. So the claim I'm going to argue for now, and it's like half a joke, half not a joke, half a joke, is that they say things like impermissivism is true and there's only one rational way to respond to the evidence, but in their heart of hearts, they're thinking there's all of these rational ways to respond to the evidence. That's just not what they're telling us. Okay, so what's my argument for this? So before the argument, just some background assumptions. The first, I call this accuracy first, but this is not accuracy first in the like technical Bristol sense. It's a very vague formulation of accuracy first. So it's just the claim that there's an important connection between our attitudes about what's rational and our attitudes about which ways of forming beliefs we expect to lead to accuracy. The second assumption, I'm calling this naturalistic meta-epistemology, which is that we don't need to think of epistemic rationality, thought and talk, in terms of the idea that there is some credence function or set of credence function that is in some brute and irreducible sense privileged, or like sometimes I'll talk about having credence functions with the halo around them, where there's just this like special property that certain credence functions have. There's not a whole lot more to say about it. If you should just sort of grok what it is if you're familiar with how to talk about epistemic rationality. And I just want to say that think about naturalistic meta-epistemology the way you might think about naturalistic meta-ethics. So in meta-ethics, there are lots of views that have the feature that the moral facts are kind of primitive and irreducible, but nonetheless, our moral thought and talk can be explained in naturalistic terms. So if you're kind of an expressivist or a quasi-realist, You might say, look, when people are talking about what's right and wrong, they're doing things like expressing their plans or their attitudes of endorsement or approval or what have you. But that's all meant to be compatible with there being facts about what's right and wrong and those facts being irreducible and so forth. So it's the same thing with naturalistic metaepistemology. It's consistent with the idea that there are irreducible facts about what's rational and there's not much more to say about what it is to be rational. It's just a primitive. But nonetheless, there's this idea that we can make sense of the human practice of talking and thinking about epistemic rationality without appealing to some brute primitive property. Okay, and then assumption 3 is going to be the principal. And primarily what I need is that my opponents accept the principal. The reason I think this is a reasonable thing to attribute to my opponents is that if you're an impermissivist, you think there's like tons and tons of constraints on what the rational prior is. And the principal is like the least controversial constraint on priors that I'm aware of. So I think if you're going to like accept that there's loads and loads of these constraints, so much that it narrows down the doxastic options to one, you should accept the principal, or you likely will accept the principal. Okay, so those are some background assumptions. Okay, now here's the argument. Premise 1. So I call this RAT-AC. To believe that it's a requirement of epistemic rationality to have a doxastic attitude of a certain type requires, at a minimum, that you regard at least some belief systems instantiating that type as more expectedly accurate than any that lack that type. So this is a kind of a meta-epistemological claim. It's saying something about what's required in order to be in the state of believing something about epistemic rationality. And specifically, I'm claiming that it involves expecting more accuracy out of beliefs that satisfy this requirement. Okay, premise 2, impermissivism requires precision. The impermissivist I'm debating will say that it is a rational requirement that one always adopt precise credences. So I'm gonna say a little bit more about this premise soon, but just to flag, this is the premise that some of the people in this room may not like. Okay, so this is my opponent saying that your credences must be precise. Okay, so from premise 1 and premise 2, it follows that if they do believe what they're saying, then they must regard some precise state as more expectedly accurate than any state that's not precise. So that follows from the first 2 premises. Okay, the third premise, I call this human opponents. The impermissivists I'm debating, in fact, have imprecise creedal states. So I doubt I'll have to do a whole lot to convince this audience of this, but just some examples, like take Horowitz's credence that it's going to rain in Honolulu next New Year's, or Durhamaj's credence that my sister is riding a bike right now. So I put forward the claim that they lack precise credences in these propositions. Okay, accuracy for imprecision. Imprecise creedal states don't regard any precise creedal state as more expectedly accurate than themselves. So this is, of course, going to depend on what kind of accuracy measures you like for imprecise creedal states. But this one, I think the people in this room and I can agree on that the right kinds of constraints on accuracy measures for imprecise creedal states don't having them recommending precise creedal states over themselves. Okay, and so from P3 and P4, it follows that these people don't regard any precise creedal state as more expectedly accurate than their own state. Okay, but what I said in the previous slide was that if they believe what they're saying, they must regard some precise creedal state as more expectedly accurate than their own state. But they don't, and so they can't believe what they're saying. Okay, so that's the argument. The basic gist of it is that, being an impermissivist, saying that there's only one rational attitude to adopt in response to any body of evidence is an expression of a kind of accuracy-ish commitment that these people don't actually have. And so they're sort of not entitled to go around saying this. Okay, so as I said, this is like half a joke. Let me say a little bit about the second premise. So, so the impermissivist, why will they say that it's a rational requirement to adopt precise credences? So first, this is kind of why I built in the principle, just I guess this is a comment specifically directed at maybe Jason and a couple other people. I think that given that they accept the principle, Jason shouldn't object to me on this particular point, but Jason can tell me otherwise. So given the requirement of the principle and some plausible constraints on accuracy measures for imprecise creedal states don't self-recommend. So they're not going to regard themselves as more expectedly accurate than every alternative state. Okay, but if you're an impermissivist and you take seriously this rationality and accuracy connection, you're not going to want to say that the uniquely rational attitude itself permits other attitudes, because then it would no longer be the uniquely rational attitude given this rationality and accuracy connection. So that's why I think impermissivists have to be precise. And so at least those that take the rationality and accuracy connection seriously and who accept the principle. Okay. So how should the impermissivist respond to this argument? So here's what I think they should say. I think they should say, look, there is a precise credence that I expect to be more accurate than my imprecise one. Now, I can't tell you what it is. I can't say like it's 0.7, but I can tell you something about it. It's the uniquely rational. Okay. And if I can, like, can you tell me anything else about it? No, that's all I can tell you about it. It's the uniquely rational one, and whichever one that is, I expect it to be more accurate than my imprecise state. So think about it a little bit like as if you had some friend, Joe, who you thought was like a real expert about weather P, and you happen to know that Joe has a precise credence in P, you're imprecise in P, and you might say, look, whatever, you know, I defer to Joe, so I expect Joe's credence to be more accurate than my own. And so these people are kind of thinking, I'm speculating that they can say something similar like, well, I'm still entitled to say that precise credences are rationally required because I think the uniquely rational credence, whatever it is precise, and I expect more accuracy from it. Okay, so here's why I'm dissatisfied by that response, which is that there's no way for me to make sense of what kind of accuracy endorsing attitude they're expressing when they say these words in the previous point that doesn't involve the talk of halos or just some primitive special property. So what they can tell me is, here's this thing about me. There's a credence function that I think is really special, and I expect the special one to be more accurate than me. But if I'm, you know, in the annoying philosopher's sense, not understanding what they are talking about when they say this special one, I want to know what it is about their belief states in non-halo terms that like is being expressed when they make this claim that rationality is impermissive. And so far, I have no way of doing that. Okay, so another way, if you're not kind of compelled by that, another way of thinking about it is just to ask the following question. This attitude that they have, that there is one credence function that's uniquely rational, even though they're imprecise, is that belief of theirs going to manifest in any of the ways they go about thinking or forming beliefs or acting or making decisions or taking bets outside of the seminar room when we're talking about whether or not rationality is or isn't permissive? And so far, you know, there's nothing that has been expressed to me about their attitudes that suggests that they are going to be going about forming beliefs, acting, making decisions in any way that's different from the way the impermissivist would. But anyway, if you think otherwise, then let me know, and we'll get back to this last point in a little bit. Okay. So, but anyway, basically, part of what I'm saying here is, in order to state your view, you can only state your view in terms of halos. So insofar as you were kind of inclined to naturalistic metaepistemology, you know, you shouldn't be happy with that. Okay, so the next point I want to make is about a similar frustration that impermissivists have had with permissivists. So just checking the time here. So impermissivists have said, no, you permissivist people, your view is no good, and it can only be stated in terms of halos. And And all of us naturalistic meta-epistemologists don't like that either. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about that move. So a lot of impermissivists, and including my past self, have wanted to say things like this. I have a credence of 0.6 in P. A credence of 0.4 in P is rational, but a credence of like 0.001 in P is not rational. Okay, so just an example of that. So so some permissivists, there's a certain kind of permissivists that say, look, not every probability function is a rational prior, but like a whole bunch of them are. So maybe I think there's just one constraint on the prior, which is that you have to obey the principal. So all of the probability functions that obey the principal principles are legitimate rational prior starting points, but the ones that don't are not. Okay, so now there's a coin. We know that it's weighted between 0.3 to 0.7. And then there's all of this evidence we get about what the weight of the coin is. So some person is telling me that it's weighted one way, another person is telling me that it's weighted another way. And anyway, I evaluate all of this evidence, and then I end up with a 0.6 credence that it lands heads. And maybe someone else ends up with a 0.4 credence that it lands heads. And I might want to say, oh, that person is rational, and I'm rational. But someone that's like 0.001, someone that's like way outside of the range that's permitted by the principle, they're not rational. Okay, so that's a view that like permissivists have been sympathetic to. And then people like Horowitz, impermissivists, have said, wait a second, what exactly are you saying when you're saying that 0.4 is rational? What is special about the range 0.3 to 0.7 from an accuracy perspective? So Horowitz points out that, for example, if I'm at 0.6, I'm going to expect more accuracy from like 0.71 than from 0.3, because 0.71 is closer to 0.6 than 0.3. So Horowitz says, look, there's nothing about this range that I think of as special accuracy-wise. So what am I saying exactly when I'm like endorsing this range of credences, other than these ones have halos around them? Okay, and then they're like, well, you wouldn't want to be talking about halos, would you? And so then you know, that's the frustration there. Okay, so here is why I think we're getting towards an impasse. So first, I don't mean that we're at an impasse in the sense that there are no more moves to be made here. I think we could keep going back and forth, and I could say you're using halos and I'm using halos. And like I could fix up my view so there are less halos, and they could probably fix up their view so that there are less halos. And like we could go on like this probably for a very long time. Part of what this is going to involve, though, is we're basically each making up a set of rules for how to use the word epistemically rational. And then saying, look, if you play the game by my rules, then the sentence rationality is permissive comes out true. And if we play the game by your rules, the set of epistemic rationality comes out false. And so then what do we end up doing is arguing about what rules we want to play by. How do we want to use the word epistemically rational? And cool, that might be a fun game, but it started occurring to me that this game, this question of how we want to use this language actually doesn't settle the kinds of questions that were initially interesting to people when they were thinking about whether or not permissivism was true. But again, this is all very new. My frustration, this whole intellectual journey has happened over like the past 2 weeks. So tell me if you disagree, and if you're like, no, settling the correct meta epistemology and all that does engage with the things that I was interested in when I was interested in permissivism. So I would like to know that. But it's kind of like, one of the things that occurred to me was that when I sit next to someone on the plane, for example, of all of the things that I've ever worked on, the thing that it's like easiest to explain is I work on the question about whether there's more than one rational way to respond to a body of evidence. People seem to both understand what that is and find it interesting and have views about it. And it just started occurring to me that if I started telling the person on the plane, like, well, the reasons to go one way rather than another way is that the way to use the phrase epistemically rational has this result rather than that result, I'm just not sure that that really engages with any of the things that they were finding interesting. So that's kind of why I'm like, okay, let's sort of start from scratch and see what was interesting about this question to begin with. And my suspicion that epistemology isn't going to help. Okay, so for the remainder of my time, and I'm going until something 30 in your time zone, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
20 minutes.
20 more minutes. Okay, great. Okay, so what were the reasons again that people were interested in permissivism? And again, I'm going to say some things, but please, add more to the list or tell me these are not the reasons. So one reason I think that permissivism has been interesting to people is that it has seemed relevant to certain deliberative questions. And by a deliberative question, I mean, I'm an agent trying to figure out how to think or how to act. And it has seemed to some that whether or not permissivism is true might bear on how I go about thinking and acting. Again, about something that's not itself permissivism, but like, what bet to take, whether to believe in God or go to church or what have you. Okay. So here's one such question. Whether to avoid subjecting ourselves to influences shape our beliefs in arbitrary ways. So I think, it's widely acknowledged that our beliefs are often subject to what are called arbitrary or irrelevant influences, just like hanging around with certain people affects our beliefs, social pressure affects our beliefs. Some people think that, natural selection has affected our beliefs in ways that are arbitrary. And some people have thought that, look, if there's a lot of permissibility, if there's more than one rational option, it's not so bad to like let yourself be kind of swayed around by the winds and have your beliefs go this way and that. As long as you're guaranteed to kind of stay rational, it's fine. Whereas maybe if rationality isn't permissive, you should be more worried about having your beliefs be subject to these influences. Okay, related question. If you know that your beliefs have been subject to one of these arbitrary influences, should you give it up? Again, I think some people have thought whether or not permissivism too might bear on that. Because if you think, well, yeah, my belief was subject to an arbitrary influence, but the alternative was rational too. So I kind of could have gone either way, so it's fine. Whereas maybe if impermissivism is true, then that's not the case. Another question has to do with disagreement. So some people have thought, if I learn that someone else disagrees with me, but I think that their view is rational, in addition to my view, if I think both of our views are rational, then there's less pressure on me to revise my own opinion. Whereas if I think only one of our beliefs is rational, then maybe there's more pressure to revise my opinion. Okay. Okay, so these are deliberative questions that don't themselves mention anything about permissivism, but I think people have thought that whether or not permissivism is true bears on these questions, and that's maybe part of why people have been interested in permissivism. Okay, then there's a very different type of question, and it's not really one that, I mean, if I have time, I might say a little bit about it, but it's not one I plan to say a whole lot, nor do I think it's one that most of the people engaged in this debate really have much expertise in. It's more of a moral question, I think of, which is like how to think about other people who disagree with us. Like how, to what degree should I like respect their opinions or, think of them as proper agents or whatever. I don't know the best way to put it, but I think there's this idea that, thinking of someone as irrational is kind of like a disdainful attitude to have towards them. And there's a kind of question about how we live with each other and as agents with different opinions and kind of how to think about each other and the fact that we disagree. And so I suspect, some of the people interested in permissivism are kind of like, how should I think about my cousin who I see every year at Thanksgiving, who like has these political views that I regard as, very false and misguided, but I want to like respect my cousin or, that kind of question. So, so anyway, there's that too. Okay, so here's how I want to end. So I want to end by doing a case study. And if there's time, I'll do two, but I think I'm just going to have time for one. Where I'm just going to take one of these deliberative questions. And what I'm going to be interested in is, first of all, can we settle the question without settling whether permissivism is true? And second of all, I guess three things. Second of all, do any of the kinds of considerations that have been brought to bear in these meta-epistemological debates bear on this deliberative question? And third, can we settle this question without deciding what the correct meta-epistemology is? If it even makes sense to talk about what the correct meta-epistemology is. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this case of letting our beliefs be subject to arbitrary influences. Okay, so Jason and I disagree about a whole bunch of things. So let's just take some proposition P that Jason and I disagree about. And suppose you're an undergrad and you're wondering whether to study at Bristol or at UT, and you're very interested in weather P. In fact, that's the only reason you want to go to graduate school, is that you're interested in weather P. Now, suppose at the moment, you're completely agnostic. So you're not more confident in P than not P, you're not more confident in not P than P, and you're also not equally confident in P and not P, meaning you don't assign them each a credence of 0.5. So you're imprecise about weather P. But suppose you know that if you go to Bristol, Jason's charismatic influence is going to lead you to become more confident in P than in not P. Whereas if you go to UT, you'll end up more confident in not P. So you know that this is just unavoidable. This is just what's going to happen if you go to grad school. And I suspect most of us, I don't know, have some personal experience with being the subject of these influences. I at least think my philosophical beliefs are like majorly influenced by the people that I've studied with and so forth. Okay. And now imagine that you care about the accuracy of your attitude about P and nothing else. So you don't care about getting a PhD or having a career in academia or, living in Bristol versus living in Austin. None of that matters to you. You just care about, pursuing accuracy concerning P. And so the question is, should you avoid going to grad school? So should you avoid allowing your beliefs to be subject to this arbitrary influence? And then there is also the question of if you go to grad school innocently before knowing about the nefarious influences of the various people who you're going to be around, but then learn about this, and that if you'd gone to the other school, you would have believed something else, then should you give up your belief? So that's the kind of question asked from the post-grad school perspective. I'm going to focus on the pre, but I think a lot of these things will be the same. Okay. And does whether permissivism is true matter? So does it matter whether or not we say that both the Bristol view and the UT view are rational, or does it not matter? Okay, so here's the first claim I want to make. Your actual belief state in this case, which is this imprecise agnostic state, does allow your beliefs to be shifted arbitrarily by going to grad school. So in other words, there is nothing about your current state that sort of recommends from an accuracy perspective that you stay where you are, as opposed to letting your beliefs be swayed around arbitrarily by going to graduate school. So this isn't something I've argued for here, but I have argued for it elsewhere. I can, if this is something people are interested in, I can talk a little bit about that. But again, just a flag, I think some of the people in this room are going to disagree with me about this. So. Okay. Now, this is true about you, even if there is one credence in P that's uniquely rational. And the thing is, if you don't know what the special credence is, if you don't know which one has a halo around it, it's unclear why it matters that there's one that you believe has a halo around it. So remember, I was thinking that the impermissivists think of rationality as a kind of expert. So they think there's one credence function that's in some sense an expert. If God came and told them this credence function is the uniquely rational one, they would all go adopt that one. Okay. But, suppose that like Joe is an expert about P, but I don't know Joe's credence in P. I'm currently imprecise about whether P. The fact that I don't know Joe's credence in P isn't really going to have much effect on how I proceed. The best I can do is proceed with the credences that I actually have, which might be informed by my opinions about what Joe's credences are or are likely to be. But anyway, if I don't know Joe's credence, I don't know Joe's credence. So partially I'm thinking, if the impermissivist does think one of these credences is special, so long as they don't know what it is, it's not clear to me how this has any relevance at all to the deliberative question about whether to allow your beliefs to be shaped arbitrarily. And even if it somehow does matter, and if you think it does matter, again, that's something I'd be interested in hearing about, I don't think it will be solved by settling on the sort of semantic rules for using the phrase epistemically rational. And again, if this is something you disagree with me about, then that would be good to know too. So in other words, I think both the permissivist and the impermissivist could come up with a set of semantic rules for how to use the phrase, one where rationality is permissive, one where it isn't. And like arguing about which of these two sets of rules is better isn't going to engage with this deliberative question at all. Okay. So the moral of just this particular case study is just that figuring out the correct metaepistemology won't help us engage with the deliberative question. Okay. So maybe I will do, I guess I will super quickly do a sort of second case study. And I'm doing this one because I think this one is kind of more friendly to the impermissivist. And this has to do with this evaluative question, the one that I kind of thought of as is maybe like almost a moral-ish question. I don't quite know really what category to think of it, exactly how to think about it. But anyway, so just so let's just go through an example. So again, imagining this person on the plane is like wondering like, what attitudes should I have towards these other people who have very different views than I do? So here's an example. Suppose that S is some paleontologist atheist, and S disagrees with these four people. So S disagrees with A, where A is a child who is told by their otherwise reliable parents that Santa Claus exists. And also with B. B is a paleontologist who, upon careful study, thinks that volcanic gases are responsible for dinosaur extinction. Whereas maybe S thinks it was, climate or something else. So S disagrees with B about this. C is a priest who believes that Jesus turned water into wine. And D is somebody who believes that COVID vaccines will cause serious health problems in most people. And E is like your average flat earther. I don't know enough about like the flat earth viewpoint to say much more, but whatever like the average flat earther thinks, that's what E thinks. And let's just stipulate that all of these people are like probabilistically coherent. Okay. So now there's this question of like, S is kind of wondering like what to think about all of these different people and their views. Okay, so I want to try and see if like we can all engage with this evaluative question without settling permissivism, without settling metaepistemology. Okay, so remember the pressure that the impermissivist was saying was like, look, if you think some other person's belief is false, what are you recommending about their belief when you say that it's rational? If we're assuming that all of this rationality talk is all about accuracy, like what's good about this false belief? Okay, so let's start with A, the child. So I take it both the impermissivists and the impermissivists, I think a lot of people would agree that, a child who was told by their parents who they have very good reason to believe is reliable, that there's some person in a red suit that's going to like give them gifts or whatever, that's true, like has good reason to believe that testimony and is perfectly rational in believing that Santa Claus exists. So, and this is true whether you're a permissivist or not. And so what exactly is anyone saying about this person's belief when they're saying it's rational? What good thing is there to recommend that belief? So I take it what, again, if you're in this business of thinking about that all these rationality claims are somehow tied to accuracy, what you're doing is saying something like, look, bracketing the information that I have and they lack, that belief looks good accuracy-wise. So when we're thinking about somebody with less evidence than we do, what we're doing is kind of saying like, okay, your belief is false and so inaccurate. But if I set aside the information I have that you don't, then your belief looks good to me. Maybe something like that is what's going on. Okay. Then I want to say, okay, in the case of the paleontologist, who maybe has the same evidence, they've all read the same papers and so forth, something similar has happened. So if I look at a paleontologist who upon careful study thinks that volcanic gases are responsible for dinosaur extinction, but I don't, I think it's like the Ice Age or something. What's going on there? What can I say about them, about their belief as far as what looks good about it accuracy-wise? Well, I take it it's going to be something like this, bracketing my commitment to weighting this theoretical virtue more highly than that theoretical virtue, your belief looks good accuracy-wise. So I want to say in both cases, when we're looking at someone that disagrees with us, but we want to say something good about their belief that's sort of accuracy-ish, what we're doing is bracketing some of our commitments and then saying that from that bracketed perspective, the belief looks good. Okay, now, of course, as long as we're talking about coherent perspectives, all of these people are such that bracketing some of the amount of stuff I think, their belief is going to look good. So this is a point also that Horowitz has made. So just to keep going through the example, take the priest. I'm going to say, okay, well, bracketing even more stuff, that belief looks good accuracy-wise. And then when I get to the people that think the COVID vaccine is super dangerous, it's like, well, bracketing even more than that, the belief looks good accuracy-wise. And then with the flat earther, it's going to be like, well, bracketing almost everything that I think, that belief looks good accuracy-wise. So all of these are all just on a spectrum. And so one question to ask is like, why are we engaging in these evaluations to begin with? Why do we care about what's likely to be true, bracketing things that we think are true? And again, I'm speculating here, but I think it must have something to do with, there might be certain reasons why we care about how things look from a bracketed perspective. So one simple one might be we're interested in like predicting and explaining how someone is going to act, like the child is going to like be really good so that they get the presents or whatever. And there also might be reasons, and I suspect, again, these are moral, social, kind of a broad range of reasons to offer some kind of endorsement for people adopting perspectives that I regard as inaccurate. So it might be like, I like that you're, applying these good belief forming rules, even though the belief you ended up with is false. Or I like that you're exploring this scientific territory that I think like as a community, we would benefit from like having people explore, even though I think it's misguided. Or I think these beliefs are, they're false, but they're contributing to a rich cultural practice. And then there might be other cases where we think actually like, it's really bad for people to like have beliefs about the earth being flat and so forth. So like, we're really not into endorsing those perspectives. So, but all of this stuff is going to be vague, come in degrees, involve lots of considerations that are not sort of distinctly epistemic, I think. So I think one thing to learn from all this, and I'm going to wrap up in just a moment, is that some of the arguments that the impermissivists, one thing to learn from the arguments they've made is that if you do want to be in the business of giving your cousin at Thanksgiving the thumbs up and say, oh, your beliefs are really great in a certain respect, it's worth thinking about what is it about these beliefs that you take to be false that you're endorsing and why. And again, we might come up with all kinds of reasons, cultural stuff, belief forming stuff, scientific diversity, whatever. But again, it doesn't seem to me like settling on the correct meta-epistemology is going to be the way forward to addressing any of these questions. Okay, so just to sum up, I've tried to convince you that meta-epistemological approaches to permissivism are not the way to make progress. We can play the game, so we can come up with rules that make rationality permissive, rules that make it impermissive, but I think that still won't answer any of the interesting questions And so I'm suggesting that we just take a look at the questions directly. Why were people interested in permissivism? And begin to see how thinking about the connection between rationality and accuracy might engage with those questions directly. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Go ahead and put your questions in the queue. We'll let Seamus kick it off.
Cool. Thanks. So this started as a sort of response to, I think there's a further move you can make in the game of the debate between permissivists and impermissivists. But I wonder actually if this ends up, being a suggestion for how to move forward without making those kind of metaepistemological moves that you think are problematic. And so here's the idea. The kind of impermissivism that you are discussing in the first part of the paper there seems to be impermissivism where the people, who are impermissivists just have some kind of like prima facie commitment to the view that there's one kind of, there's only one rational credence, right? And the worry then is, well, where's this halo for that particular credence coming from or whatever? But it seems like you might end up being an impermissivist by accident, right? If you just happened to endorse sufficiently many other like well-motivated constraints on rational choice such that there's only one that satisfies them, right? Now, if you were in that happy situation, like you'd be an impermissivist, right? In the sense that it would follow from your commitments that there's only one rational credence. But you'd have like, there'd be good reason why that one had the halo, right? Put it another way, like this is not like, I'm not, making some, like, I'm not, having some commitment to permissivism or impermissivism, right? I've just got a bunch of rational commitments that we can talk about one way or the other. And it turns out that has consequences for the debate about permissivism and impermissivism.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea here, I take it, is I don't need to have any beliefs about halos. I could just endorse a bunch of principles like principle and infer to the best explanation and blah, 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 blah. And those first order commitments of mine might just pick out a unique credence. So I think if that's the circumstance, then that's great. So then be an impermissivist and like, let's argue about whatever these principles are, and like, awesome, like I'm willing to potentially get on board. Part of what I didn't state explicitly, but I was building into my human opponents assumption, was actually that none of us have a set of commitments that are sufficiently fine-grained to pin down a unique credence function. So, like, for example, oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to follow up. So
yeah.
if I just understand that assumption, that is, none of us actually satisfy enough commitments to pin down a unique credence, or none of us endorse enough. Like, because I could be in a situation where I know I don't satisfy all of the commitments I have, but if I did, I'd be precise. Or if I did,
the latter. So I think we don't endorse enough commitment.
Wait, just to be clear, let's pick somebody randomly like Edwin James. And I mean, even if Edwin lacks the fortitude to have a precise credence, you think not committed to have the uniquely rational prior that sort of seems to follow from maximum entropy. Still not committed.
Okay, so sorry. So maximum entropy. So like principle of indifference, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So that would be like a great way forward if you wanted to be an impermissivist, to say, I endorse the principle of indifference, and then that privileges, and then that's going to pin down a unique credence to adopt in any situation. So, in theory, yes, cool. But I think the principle of indifference doesn't, because of like cube factory problems and that type of thing. So I think it's just a, perhaps an accidental fact about us that I don't think anyone has ever put forward a set of principles that pin down a unique credence to adopt in every proposition given any body of evidence. So I don't think there's anything like, I don't think if we thought about it really hard or like lived a million years or whatever, I just don't think there's anything about our doxastic states that is sufficiently sharp to pin down a unique credence to adopt in any given situation. Maybe that would be true if we just had like a super simple algebra with like two propositions or something in it, and then we could use something like principle of indifference. But I think in reality, our attitudes, that's not enough, because it doesn't decide these problems about cube factories.
Okay, Kevin.
Cool. So this is partly, I guess, a sort of follow-up to James's question, and then I guess it's partly a little bit different. But so, you had this slide, right, where you had the exact response that I was sort of thinking about making about this sort of like, I can't sort of describe it de re, right? And so I was thinking, okay, I mean, so what if you're someone, right, I don't know, I guess, so like Teitelbaum, right, has like an argument, right, that like mistakes about rationality or mistakes of rationality or something, right? So you sort of think that like all of the sort of rational constraints on credence functions should be maybe a priori deducible or something. But then, right, suppose that you think of people that we're sort of not sufficiently good at reasoning to be able to determine like what all of these are. And so you might think, right, that there is going to be a sort of fact for objective reasoners that are like much better than ourselves, that there would be like, all of these sort of constraints that you might think end up being unique, that you would be able to sort of like rationally argue for, but you sort of think, okay, like given our limitations, right, we won't be able to know like which those are. And then it seems like that's a view where it's not completely weird to say that there is this like, there is this objective thing. I can't really tell you what it is. Like I realize of myself that I'm like so bad that I'll never be able to know what it is. Something like that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, good. So I would want to like, yeah, I'm like excited. Like, I feel like, yeah, these are the right kinds of moves to make. But so then like, what happens next? So I'd say, well, what do you mean these people that are reasoning better than yourself? What makes someone a better reasoner than you? Is it that they're better at like doing logical inferences? Well, that's not going to help. Is it that they're, well, anyway, I would ask you to tell me more. And then my suspicion is that you yourself don't have standards for what makes someone a better reasoner that are such that would suggest that a better reasoner will have some precise.
I'm not one of these people also, but
or any human. Yeah.
Could I just really also quickly ask, how much of this is related to subjectivism versus objectivism? When you're sort of thinking about this haloing, because like a lot of the arguments sort of felt like when you're saying, okay, like does the impermissivism matter? And then you're like, okay, well, you can't sort of tell which one of these, right? And so then how is that going to be sort of impactful in your decision making? But if you have like a really objectivist standard of correctness, which like I don't have, right? I'm very subjectivist, but like there could be people who would say, okay, like you're screwed, right? There's nothing you subjectively can do, but whatever, there is still, right?
Good. Yeah. So one response that someone might have to some of this is to say, here's why permissivism or impermissivism matters. If impermissivism is true, then there is a uniquely rational credence function. We don't have it. We don't have like even principles that would recommend it. So it's kind of like out of our reach. And the result of that is that we cannot engage these kinds of deliberative questions, because any deliberative question that someone asks from a perspective that is irrational is like, well, so a lot of epistemologists have this view, right? Like, I'm not in the business of like helping irrational people like find their way out of their irrationality. If you're irrational, you're sort of out of my interest of discussion. And so, yeah, so one difference might be that, an impermissivist is actually going to say we can't engage in these deliberative questions. There's nothing interesting to be said in engaging in deliberation about like how to let our beliefs be formed and so forth. Whereas maybe the permissivist is willing to engage. So, I think that's like a debate that could be had and a place where permissivism might matter. As far as though the whole idea of like, let's engage with the reasons people were interested in this question to begin with, if the idea is, well, actually, we're not going to engage in the reasons you were interested in because you're not rational enough for us to be worth engaging with, then I feel like, okay, well, then you've given up on doing that. So maybe that's the thing to do. But if the hope was to not do that, then yeah.
Okay, Dan has a follow-up, I think.
Yeah, so my question was also going to be about subjectivism versus objectivism, about reasons. And, you said a lot of things about ethics and meta-ethics and how they sort of there on the question here. And I thought, well, just things that you were saying about the different kinds of perspectives that people might have and how we might kind of view their reasoning as accurate based on sort of bracketing in a way what their perspective might be, made me really think of the sort of internal versus external reasons kind of framework. And I was wondering if you had thought at all about a kind of sort of parallel, because obviously it's in the context of reasons for action, but in this context of rationality for belief. And if you have thought about that, whether or not you understand accuracy simply with respect to the norm of truth, or whether you understand accuracy as something that might also be something that is understood maybe as a little bit more broadly as to do with a sort of internal, accurate internal model that might not be sort of in line with objective truth.
Are you thinking that there might be a kind of accuracy to pursue where it's not like I'm trying to get my beliefs to match the world, but I'm trying to get my beliefs to like match normative reality or something?
Yeah, so I always struggle a little bit when people are talking about accuracy, because I wonder what they mean exactly when they're talking about accuracy, right? Because accuracy is assuming a particular sort of system in which you're working, and then you kind of reach accuracy within that system. Truth is something that's a little bit sort of more, I think debatably, but you can think more easily, I think, of truth as something that has to do with objective reality. I think the internal versus external reasons in the metaethics sort of literature maps really quite nicely with some of the things that you're saying, because an internal reason is something that someone would have reason to do because of their sort of particular sort of desires and state of knowledge and so on, beliefs, whereas the external reason has to do with moral truths, with some kind of objective fact about the world, right? And so I was wondering if you had thought about this connection at all, or if not, that's totally fine.
Yeah. I say I've thought a ton about this connection. I mean, one thought I have had is that, and not just me, a lot of people have had, is that if you're willing to be kind of sufficiently externalist and you are an accuracy first person, then what you should say is that there is a uniquely rational credence to adopt. It's the one that assigns credence 1 to all truths and credence 0 to all falsehoods. So, that's not a position a lot of people have found very attractive. And I think that's in part because a lot of people engaged in this enterprise have some kind of internalist sympathies where they think somehow there are questions about how to proceed, given our lack of information about the world. So so I do think that, you know, especially if you're into like a kind of accuracy first-ish perspective and you reject adopt the omniscient credence function, that does kind of push you towards a more internalisty way of thinking about things. But that's about all. That's about the only connection I've made to that literature. But thank you.
Thank you. Yes, no, sorry, I'm not really familiar with the literature on accuracy, so it might be a bit of a silly question. But
No.
thanks.
Yeah.
All right, Jasper.
Yeah, hi there. So at some point you said this thing that intrigued me, which is that it's always fine to go more precise with your credences, and I think not the opposite. I don't know whether this is a short version of the argument that leads you to say that, but I'm definitely interested.
Yeah.
Intrigued / triggered.
Triggered. I should have had a content warning before this talk. Okay, so let's see what I can say briefly. So I guess the shortest thing I can say is that I have a paper with David Buelas and Sophie Horwitz called Dilating and Contracting Arbitrarily, where we argue that two things. So first of all, we argue that the epistemic utility theories that we like allow for both arbitrary dilation and arbitrary contraction. But we think that that's bad because we think for sure arbitrary dilation is bad. For sure, if you're like 0.6, it shouldn't be good to go to like, 0.5 to 0.8 or something like that.
Okay, so it's really dilation is central to the argument. You want to avoid this.
Yes, exactly. So we want to take that as a kind of constraint on how to think about accuracy for imprecision, that it forbids arbitrary dilation. This is different from the kind of dilation we were talking about before in the previous talk, where you get evidence which makes you dilate. Right? This is just dilate for the heck of it.
Dilate for no reason.
In response, like no evidence, just like, yeah.
I just follow. So like the kinds of scoring rules that we like forbid arbitrary contraction and dilation.
Yes,
So,
right. That's
a reason to
preface.
Go on our side.
Yeah. Good. Yes, and that's another way to go is join this crew over here, and you won't get arbitrary contraction and dilation. But this side, I don't know exactly who in the room agrees with Jason, but I suspect there's like a crew. But I'll just call it Jason's side. Reject certain constraints on accuracy measures in the EUT framework that Buelas, Horwitz, and I think are good constraints to adopt. And I do think, and again, Jason, I really would be interested to hear what you say. I do think that if you think the principal is a rational requirement, you should accept those constraints on accuracy measures. I think Jason doesn't think the principal is a rational requirement, and that's fine. But in this dialectical context, we are assuming the principal is a rational requirement. So the EUT constraints, I think, do allow both dilation and contraction some of the time. And so if we wanted to rule that out, so we wanted to come up with a framework that ruled that out, and we basically took a version of Sophie Horwitz's educated guess way of thinking about accuracy, and came up with a system that does rule out dilation. So that's why we thought this was like an improvement, but it does also permit arbitrary contraction.
And you're okay with that? Like no additional info, and then bam, I go precise.
I'm like deeply liberated by it because because I think this is what happens to us in life, and I used to be like very disturbed that this was happening to me all of the time in life, and I really am convinced though that accuracy wise it is completely okay. So I recommend it, take an plunge, go on an adventure and enjoy. Yeah.
I see.
But it's very unintuitive. I want to grant it. It's extremely unintuitive. Yeah.
I mean, just a historical no. I mean, I think Jeffrey was not totally unsympathetic to this kind of thing.
What makes you say that?
When he's responding, I'll find the quote for you and send it. I mean, there are contexts where he's asked about a particular paradox, and he says, "Well, if I were to face this problem, I would just plumb for some precise thing."
Oh, yeah.
That in the context of decision
Right.
making.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
You just got to pick a probability.
Pick a
and
probability.
back
Yeah.
up with respect to that. That's basically what he says.
Yeah.
We still have snow in the queue, so let's dump the snow.
Okay, thank you so much. This is sort of going back to Deb's question before, and basically just inviting you to say a little bit more about the last few slides. In particular, your thoughts on the relationship between rational evaluation, bracketing, and holding on to your own belief. Because when you introduce the notion of bracketing, that immediately reminds me of Christensen's independence principle. But of course, he himself concedes that it's very controversial what that principle even says. But then the rough idea is basically when you confront someone who disagrees with you, somehow when you're deciding both whether or not the person is rational and also how should you revise your own belief, the thought is somehow you should bracket some information like your first order reasoning or something like that. And that makes me wonder, it seems that in the last few slides, the impression I got is that somehow I can bracket this information, evaluate the accuracy while still holding on to my belief. But then you might think actually when you do the bracketing, somehow the bracketing should also, the special kinds of bracketing should also inform whether or not it is rational for you to hold on to your own belief. And then, so it seems like there's some tight connection going back to like rational evaluation, bracketing, and then holding on to a belief. Just sort of the things are complicatedly related to each other. And I'm curious what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, great. Okay, good. So this is still a kind of part of this that I'm still working out. So when I talked about the deliberative questions, I had 3, and the last one I didn't touch on at all, which is how to respond to disagreement. And that's really the kind of stuff that Christensen is talking about. And I get the bracketing language and all of that from him. And when I was talking about the evaluative thing, I was kind of assuming, like you were saying, like, let's imagine a case where for whatever reason I'm entitled to hold on to my own belief. How should I think about somebody else? But I do think that I do think it's like the same. I do think all of this is very relevant to the disagreement stuff too. So here's how I'm starting to think about it. But as I said, I haven't fully worked this out. But so when we encounter someone that disagrees with us, so I think what Christensen has very compellingly argued is that the kind of radical views in disagreement, which require like I completely suspend judgment in response to someone who disagrees with me, requires that I be evaluating them from a bracketed perspective, right? Because if I'm allowed to be evaluating them from my own perspective, then even if I take their disagreement to be some evidence against my view, it won't in general completely neutralize things. Okay, so then I think the question is, so take someone that disagrees with me. So like say the priest that believes that Jesus turned water into wine. So say we disagree. So now the thing that I need to do, so if there's going to be an argument for the claim that I ought to abandon my belief in response to that disagreement, the way that's going to go is by me saying, look, bracketing the things we disagree about, like there's no reason for me to privilege my view over his or something like that. Okay. But then what I want to, so then what I want to say is, okay, so let's suppose we take this bracketing thing seriously and say that in a case of disagreement, it's really important how things look from this bracketed perspective. And again, I want to say here, it actually now doesn't matter what we judge in terms of how many views are rational. What matters is what the bracketed perspective permits accuracy-wise. And so I think lots of times when we bracket, especially if we have to bracket a lot because they disagree with us about a lot of stuff, the bracketed perspective is quite imprecise. And if the bracketed perspective is imprecise, then according to me, the bracketed perspective is going to allow you to hold on to your opinion, switch to their opinion, suspend judgment, or do a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's kind of the connection I want to draw. I want to say, actually, the permissivism question isn't, we don't really need to settle that, figure out how to respond to disagreement. We just need to ask, how do things look when we bracket? And then I want to say, oftentimes when we bracket, that state permits multiple options, including perhaps the one we had, perhaps our opponents. And so, does that answer your question?
Interesting. Actually, I thought you might go the other way around, just to tell you what my initial thought was, and then see whether or not they're different. Which is, I thought maybe here's just a new light on the whole disagreement and also permissivism debate, which is there's a question of bracketed evaluation, and there's a question of bracketed deliberation. And you might think bracketed evaluation doesn't entail bracketed deliberation, and if you take the permissivist debate really sort of bear on the deliberative question, then we can have a sort of thin permissivism you might want for bracketed evaluation because of for the reasons that you mentioned, while still say, well, that doesn't settle the debate for the deliberative side. But then there's a huge, so basically what we need is a bridge law between bracketed evaluation and bracketing in deliberation. And that's my initial thought, but I feel like they're consistent, but yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let me just see if I can say one thing that maybe connects those two. I really like the way you put that. So yeah, I do think that the evaluation questions and the deliberative questions kind of live in two different spheres. I don't have a way of making that very precise, but I kind of feel like you might be in the business of one or in the business of the other, and they don't bear on each other in any super direct way. But I guess what I think the key thing that's relevant to the deliberative disagreement question is the kind of is the question of, when I encounter someone that disagrees with me, should I bracket? If the answer is no, then you'll get to hold on. Maybe you'll modify your opinion a bit, but you'll still hold on to your opinion. So that's that. If the answer is yes, then now we're kind of looking at things from the bracketed perspective, and then that's where this like imprecise and all this kind of stuff can come in. But I think, yeah, the first question is just, is bracketing the appropriate response to disagreement? And that's like a deliberative question that's interesting and important, but also I think that permissivism doesn't really bear on.
All right, that brings the conference to a close. Let's thank Miriam for an excellent talk.
Thank you so much. That was like really helpful, and yeah.